So it's only going to record me and the screen here. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here today, and thank you for having me here today for this talk in which we are going to talk about speaking truth to power. And so when we were talking about this particular topic and I was thinking about what to talk about, so I hesitated a little bit because I know that when you talk about things like that, which are sensitive, that how should you be talking about gender-based violence or domestic abuse, and how should you broach the subject, and especially should you be courageous enough to do it, is not always easy. And I'm talking about gender-based violence, but that's true with many other sensitive topics, no matter what we talk about. So I was a bit hesitant not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew that saying something can cost something. And that's the type of topic that I want to talk about today. So speaking truth to power, it's a phrase that we use all the time. In academia, we attach it to our mission statements. We use it in terms of our promotion criteria and various other places when where we refer to different things. We celebrate it in retrospects when somebody who has been speaking truth to the power has been affected by it, and the dust has settled, and the speaker has been vindicated, and afterwards. But what does it actually mean? What does it cost when we have to speak about something that people think we shouldn't really be doing it, and who bears the cost? And that is something that I would like to talk today in this particular session, using gender-based violence research as an example, something that sits at the intersection of evidence, policy, politics, and profound human suffering for those who are affected by it. And usually most of those are women. Okay, so if I can move my slides. So in terms of the role of professors, we know that has changed dramatically over periods of time. We are no longer expected to simply to produce knowledge, which was usually used in academia by other academics. And the public engagement is no longer an optional element. It is required as part of the job. It is expected. And in the same way, impact, policy influence, and media visibility are now expected from all of us. They are in our job description, they are in our promotion criteria, and as well as in our funding applications, where we have to say, what did you do different? Where did you speak about various different things? But here is the tension. While universities increasingly demand public scholarships, institutional comfort with controversies remain profoundly uneven. We want people to talk about it, but in a limited way. We are asked to have an impact, but not too much impact. We want ourselves to be engaging with policy, but not too politically. To speak to the media, but not in a way that generate complaints, which then creates an impossible position for those of us working in topics that are sensitive by nature, such as the gender-based violence and domestic abuse. So let's look at the gender-based violence element. I'm sure all of you know, but just to give some context, gender-based violence refers to the abuse or the violence which people endure because of their gender, because of who they are. And most of the time, in the UK, internationally, and everywhere, it's usually women and girls. So anyone can experience it, but the large proportion of the victims and sufferers are always girls and women. Therefore, we also see the terminology used as violence against women. So violence against women is something that is policy focused at the moment. In 2024, National Police Chief Counselor identified as a national emergency. So it's not as a priority, not as a concern, but as a national emergency. After that, in December 2025, government has published cross-government violence against women strategy, where they have pledged to reduce violence against women by half within a decade. So there is quite a lot of focus on working on violence against women and interest in working on violence against women. But at the same time, there is the ideological backlash as well. And what we see is that nearly 40% of young men, for example, hold a positive view of Andrew Tate. And those of you who know Andrew Tate, it is all about misogyny and all about, like, how women should be treated or what their space should be. We also know that technology facilitated abuse has escalated, and especially against women and women who are in visible spaces. And we also know that researchers who speak publicly face coordinated attacks. And we will look into some examples about that as we go along. So gender-based violence research, while it has never been more needed, and it's also a time when it's never been more contested. And when we look at the other aspects of silence, we know that silence is often rewarded, but it really protects the public good. So therefore, the question that I would like to explore with all of you is that what is the role of professoriate? We have got a collective responsibility to protect and model principled public scholarship, particularly when where silence perpetuates harm. So it's a collective responsibility and not an individual one. And what I want to talk about today through this session, three things, three forms of silences: the silence that we inherit, the structural forces that determine who gets to speak, who gets to heard, who gets to believe, and who gets dismissed before even they open their mouth. Second, the silence that we face. What actually happens when we have spoken? What actually happens that we say something, and what is the cost and who bears the cost? And finally, the third one, the pressures towards conformity, even by secure academics and those who are very well respected, and how do they have to behave? So I will conclude with what I believe that we as professors should be doing and supporting our younger generations. So the first element is about the silence that we inherit. Who gets heard and who gets believed? So I would like to ask a couple of questions here. Who is seen as objective? Who is labeled as emotional? And who must repeatedly prove their credibility? These are some of the questions that we should always be thinking about. While we treat objectivity as something important, but is that ever neutral? Is that experienced equally by everyone? I don't think so. Because some voices are assumed to be objective before even they have started speaking. Others have to prove themselves and explain how they have done what they have done. They have to explain their methodology. They have to explain their findings, which they have come up with, how they did it. So they have to literally demonstrate the rigor of the work which they have done. And then there are perception. So then there are other who are able to speak with authority without having to go with any of those demands. So the perception of neutrality is often granted rather than earned. At the same time, there are scholars who find themselves called emotional, especially those working on the issues which are sensitive, such as harm, inequalities, gender-based violence, domestic abuse. Women scholars, for example, those working in caring disciplines, or those researching sensitive issues that I've just talked about, because they may be questioned, is that your passion and your own personal view, or is that actually happening? Are you telling the truth that women are experiencing abuse, and is that really how it happens, or is it just what or something that you would like to talk about? And then there is a question about credibility. Some academics begin from position of presumed legitimacy, whereas others have to demonstrate their expertise more frequently, as I've said a little bit earlier on. The point here is not to assign blame to anyone, but it is to recognize that evidence does not move through a natural and neutral landscape. It moves through structures of power, hierarchy, and expectations. So therefore, based on what disciplines do you work in. So, for example, my discipline, if you're nurses, and what your historical positioning have been in the medicine, in the work, in the environment that you have been working with relative to other professions, especially, for example, medicine, and the devaluation of practice-based and applied knowledge, and how that is seen and how other people have seen it. What are the assumptions about real expertise are, and who gets to have those real expertise? All of that has an impact. Gender, I've just talked about earlier on, that women's expertise are usually seen very, very differently on all the topics, but especially when it comes to the topics related to women issues. The implicit question that we usually ask them, are you an objective researcher? Or do you have an agenda that you want to talk about? And therefore, it's based on your assumptions and your feelings and your views about something. And then, of course, when we talk about race, ethnicity, and other elements, religion, if you are from any of the minority groups, and that minority can be defined differently depending on the location and geography where we are talking about, you are usually then expected to know nothing and be happy and grateful for the space that is being provided to you. And then we get the label, especially with regards to when we talk about gender, gender-based violence related issues, get the label of being feminist. So people already label you as someone who hates men, maybe because you talk about those issues, because many people don't think that women can have challenges, or they would just think that it's very, the issues that we talked about are not always real, or women are responsible for themselves, for the state they are in. And if you challenge it, you're usually being told that, oh, well, you've misunderstood. That's not what we meant. And that's not what we said, when they actually fully meant when they were saying it. So you know that you're being gaslighted, but there is not a lot that you could do about, because it's really difficult to then counter argue or say that that's not possible. So the constant calculation that researchers who work on on those sorts of sensitive areas such as gender-based violence have to kind of go through and look into it. So what messages does this send to the next generation that we are raising? What should they learn about what is sayable and what is not sayable, and how should they navigate the system? So let's now talk about the second form of silence that we face. What we already know, that the proportion of women journalists and people who talk about sensitive issues already experience quite a lot of backlash and quite a lot of negative experiences that they have. The proportion of women journalists reporting that online abuse has escalated from 20% to 42% in 2025. So this is within the last 3 years. And at the same time, 1 in 4 women human rights defender, activists, and journalists have experienced AI-assisted online abuse, including deepfake imagery and manipulated content, because of what they say or what they support. And Scholars at Risk Scholar at Risk documented 395 attacks on scholars, students, and institutions across 49 countries. And that's the data between July 2024 and June 2025. So academic freedom is usually declined in various parts of the world. And if you look at the number, that's gone into 36 out of 179. The data was taken from 179 countries, and this has been reported from the 36 countries from which the data was taken and analyzed. The FIRE survey of 2025 also says that 94% of sanctioned scholars have reported their experience and the negative impacts of the experiences that they have, which includes reputational damage, PTSD, and job losses. And of course, their family members and students and other people who are associated with them also have to experience the fallout. And then, of course, there is this thing about when institutions disappear. I learned that element very, very early on when I was a nursing student, and I'm talking about 96, 97, and in one of the events where the topic was that how do we feel safe, and what I said in one of the events that you don't need to do anything else apart from the fact that just don't make us uncomfortable when we are walking across the corridor, across the roads and the places and the paths that we are going through. Just let us feel safe. And the next day there were posters against my name and what I said across the hospital and in the all organizations. And all those in power, people in those institutions were nowhere to be seen and nowhere, and they didn't really do anything. They just disappeared. And I'm using that as an example, but it's very, very true even today's world that all these institutions where we talk about courage and where we talk about saying something which is disruptive and useful, do people actually get supported when they have actually said something? So are institutions there when people need it? So this was my formative lesson in how institutions behave when it costs them something to support you. And more recent examples, and I've just only taken a couple of examples here. Sarah Ahmed from Goldsmith University in 2016. She was somebody who founded the Center of Feminist Research, and she had to resign over institution's failure to address sexual harassment. And what she said that I have resigned because the cost of doing this work have been too high. Another example is Kathleen Stock from Sussex in 2021. She was a professor of philosophy. And when people didn't like what she has to say, the police advised her, the university advised her to stay off campus and install CCTV at home. And therefore, kind of, take the responsibility for herself. The university is then fined $585,000 in 2025, and this case is still going on. And that was just, because they couldn't support it. But that's the impact on both of these individuals. And these are just two examples that I've provided here. So both of these cases are different and the politics is different. Having said that, both illustrate institutional abandonment when somebody is saying something that others don't like. And then there is more evidence. For example, Fire Survey of Sanctioned Scholars, which looked at 209 academics targeted for their speech, they've reported 94% have experienced or reported negative impact, 40% felt shunned at work, 20% lost their job, and 47% lost professional relationships with other colleagues. And one of the respondents says that my biggest disappointment was in the cowardice of other faculty who refused to do anything public in my behalf. And I think I'm going to come back to the point about, when we support people in private, but never stand up with them in public. And that's too common. And all of you may have experienced or come across that as well. But when it comes to women and minoritized scholars, again, the attacks could be different and the intensity could be different as well. They're more personal. They may target on people's appearances, how they speak, what they do, their family, their sexuality, their religious identity, or anything else that anybody can get hold of. They can be accused of being divisive or having an agenda about something, and sexual harassment and threats that extends not only to them, but their students, their family members, and those associated with them. And that's the compounding impact of intersecting identities that people have to go through. And all of this is happening within the context of what happens on the social media and how overall demographic aspects are changing. So I'm using the example here of Andrew Tate's phenomena. So if we look at it, there are over 40% of young men who hold a positive view of Andrew Tate, and 13% of young men aged 16 to 29 age, and 17% of boys between the age of 6 and 15 years of age, they hold positive opinions about what Andrew Tate says and the topics that he covers in. Boys, there have been reports boys using Tate's misogynistic tropes as social currency in the school, and teachers report that in the school from boys, sexist attitudes toward female peers and teachers has increased quite a lot. He suggests that society is not unjust due to broader societal issues, but because men have been stripped of power by women and feminism. And so his approach looks very, very simplistic, and seems like a quick fix for younger boys and young men who feel confused and alienated, and therefore people sign up to to what he says and believe on what he says, and then even kind of make other people experience the impact of their beliefs and actions. Now let's look at the third element of the silence that we choose. So when somebody says something, do we help and support them? Even among those with security, pressures encourages silence. Even people who are able to say something would not be able to stand with you when on topics that they think saying something publicly can going to have an impact on them. They may come to you in a private sort of element, but not necessarily right in front of other people. Then we have systematic issues. For example, we talk about impact, we talk about talking to media and everything else, but does that always get rewarded the way in terms of the systems in which we work in? Promotion criteria that don't adequately reward public engagement, because there would be a certain type of public engagement that would be rewarded and accepted. Collegiality norms that discourage controversy because you want to support one person, but then you don't want to alienate others, and how that's going to have an impact on you as an individual. Risk aversive institutional cultures. So all of this then means that you always have to calculate and see, is this something that I should be talking about, or shall we just leave it the way it is and don't even support who are going through it? And of course, the fear of being labeled difficult or someone who is causing problems all the time. And of course, we know that those with least secure positions, so for example, early career researchers, people who have got precarious contracts, those who are on visas or other sort of risky elements, often take the greatest risk, while those with more security stay silent. How many times people who are already established find or support others who are going through these difficulties and publicly support them or talk anything about them, or in terms of institutions? And the private supporters. I have been in many situations, and I'm sure all of you would be able to recognize that when people come and tell you in one-to-one interactions that they support you, but when you expect that support publicly, that is never there. So what is the cost? What does this cost? This costs the person who usually speaks up as exposed. They initially may feel that they were the one who were wrong. They are the one who have created problems. They are the one who are doing something which others don't see, and therefore that's the way they are treated is maybe appropriate. They're the one who feel isolated, the sense that you imagine the support, but the support is never there when you're actually looking for it. So the exhaustion of carrying the burden yourself all alone, and the exhaustion of trying to justify you whenever you see someone as to why you're saying what you're saying. And the cost is also the field and the discipline in which we work in, because the private agreement doesn't translate into public solidarity, and the things that we want to talk about publicly are never supported and never available. So that then hampers the discipline's progression into the knowledge development as we go along. And of course, that also has an implication for the next generation, who look up to you as individual and learn from what you do. And what they learn is that maybe this is how it works. Maybe this is how you should behave. And therefore, maybe, you should keep your head down and don't say anything. And we all know that it takes quite long time for people to find their own voices. And there's a very long time in which you only do what you have seen other people doing it before you get, and when you find your voice, and if you go through those elements again, then you again shut down and, it becomes silent. So then again, this doesn't help other people who are going through that. So I call this something called silence ladder, which starts off with earlier on when you feel very enthusiastic about it. You look at the evidence and you talk about the issues and the problems that you experience. But then you are being exposed to scrutiny, misinterpretation of what you have said and why you have said. Your visibility may be heightened. You realize that you're being watched and examined by other people, and maybe you've said something that others don't like, which then means that you're self-monitoring in terms of thinking about watching what you're saying, looking at your language, checking and deciding where you need to engage and how you have to say what you have to say. So you start calculating yourself, and then that leads to strategic withdrawal from engagements that you want to be engaged on, or things that you wanted to say. You start not saying those elements, not talking about those aspects, and eventually you become silent and you're not present on the spaces and on where you should be present, or where you have something to say, or you don't want to talk about any of those elements because the public, you don't feel supported enough, and therefore the public also loses your voice and the thoughts that you have. I've seen this happening to many people, including myself. And even if you are resilient and courageous enough to go back to your previous self, it can take quite a long time to be able to talk about the issues. So enough of the problems and knowing as to what happens. What is it that we can do to stop that? Is there anything that we could do to bring up a change? I think there is, and that is that is how we interact with other people. That is how we think and how we behave with our junior colleagues and ourselves, and in the work area and the domain that we work in. So first of all, we need to mentor differently. We need to prepare the next generation of public scholarships to take the risk, but then when we encourage people to take the risk, be there to support them. Don't let them discover all of those elements by themselves on their own. Teach them the strategies, the calculation, and the things that they need to think about so that they can prepare effectively, or at least when backlash happens, it's not a surprise, and they can plan for the next kind of move for themselves. Speak when it costs less for us. So if there is someone who is speaking the truth, or who is talking about sensitive issues which are elements that feels not really comfortable and are not being supported, try and help and support them in doing so, especially early career researchers and other people, because their career may be going through the threatening stage, but yours is not. So your support can mean a lot, because you could speak for them in the spaces where they cannot speak. Go public with support. And I think that makes a lot of difference in terms of publicly supporting somebody, because that does not only help them publicly, but it also gives them courage to be able to stand up for themselves. So I think that's something that's really, really important about that. Advocate institutionally. Push universities to develop clear policies protecting academics engaged in public scholarship on contested issues and topics. Hold institutions accountable to their shared values and how those are practiced. And finally, model it. Continue to do the work visibly despite the pressures. Show the next generation that it is possible and what can be done and how things can be developed further. So returning to the current moment, the point that I started talking about for violence against women, we know that it's in the context of UK, it's identified as a national emergency, but that's across the globe, and everywhere the situation is same. the strategy in the UK to halve violence against women in a decade. And then we know that there is unprecedented policy attention in terms of trying and making reducing violence against women possible. But at the same time, as we talked about, there is the ideological backlash. Misogyny is quite high. Technology is being used in terms of abusing people in very different way that most of this we don't even have learned about. We also know that researchers who speak publicly face real risk, and institutions often fail to protect those who need protection. So what is it that we could do? I think we need to ask ourselves the question, what will you say publicly that you have only said privately? Will you support people when they need it? Who will you stand beside? And what will you do with the security you have to help those who don't have that kind of security and opportunities? So silence when it comes to gender-based violence perpetuates harm. And this is just one example that I have used it here. Thank you for listening.